Hey, my friends, welcome back to the Uncommodified podcast and another UNCORK conversation with my great friend and leadership historian, Craig Minchin. Craig, how you doing this morning?
I'm doing very, very well. Great to be with you as always, my friend.
Awesome. Listen, I'm going to tell everybody it is this morning, even though we are going to have a whiskey together. I'm not going to pretend it's 7 or 8 o'clock at night. It's 9:30 in the morning. And what better way to kick off a conversation with my friend, Craig Minchin, than having a whiskey together at 9:30? Life doesn't get better than this, Craig, does it?
Well, I always say it's happy hour somewhere.
It is. It's always happy hour where I am, so I'm good to go. Now, a very good friend of mine gave me a really interesting whiskey for Christmas. Now, I have to be honest, the very good friend was Craig, but Craig gave me a really great whiskey for Christmas, and I'm going to just show everybody if you're watching my video. I'll let everybody else know it's called Natterjack. Now, I didn't know. Is this a nickname for me? Now, is this what you call me? Do you call me Natterjack?
Yeah, I didn't want to admit it, but yes, absolutely. That's what we've called you for years behind your back.
I bet you had Natterjack. I love it, and this is an interesting whiskey. And I always get fascinated, Craig, by the marketing on whiskey stuff.
Yeah.
So just for fun, I got to read the back of this one because it's super playful. I like it. It says Natterjack, a unique fusion of Irish and American whiskey traditions. Reckless, maybe. Adventurous, absolutely. I love it. So, hey, with that, cheers, my friend.
All
I
right.
haven't opened this bottle yet that you gave me. I'm going to open it now, and we're going to kick this conversation off. Oh yeah, that's got a nice flavor. That's that Irish and American whiskey coming together there. Mm. Cheers, my friend.
Excellent. Excellent. Cheers.
Awesome. Hey, listen, let me kick this off this way. This conversation with you is going to be a little bit different because the last couple of times that we've chatted, the leaders that we were chatting about, I had a lot of deep knowledge and even some experience with Winston Churchill. I've been to England. I've been to Chartwell. I have some experience with his history there with MLK. I've studied him. I've been to Atlanta. I've been to his home where he was born, the old Ebenezer Church, and so I had some experience with him. Alexander the Great, have to admit, never met the man. I've never been to that part of the world, and so I don't know as much about him. So, as much as this will be a discovery conversation for our listeners, it's going to be a discovery conversation for me today because it's a leader that I don't know a lot about. And frankly, when you suggested, hey, let's talk about Alexander the Great, I'm thinking, are we going to teach everybody to kill people? Like, what are we going to learn from Alexander the Great other than, man, you should conquer the world, and if people don't submit, you may have to slit their throat, which is a leadership strategy, Craig, for some leaders, as you know, but not usually one I recommend to my listeners. So I am really excited about this conversation because I have no idea exactly where this is going to go and what it's going to be about. So I'll be discovering it as we go, just like our listeners will. So I really appreciate, again, just the discipline you have around research. Just give me a ballpark estimate. How many hours do you think you've spent researching and reading about Alexander the Great over the years?
Certainly in the last year, it's been hundreds of hours. Um, we know a lot about him, and I get sucked into the story, and that's why I love history because I love stories, and there's so much about him. So yeah, I've spent probably hundreds of hours getting into him, his family, really geeky stuff, Tim. Like I get into the logistics of how his army worked, some of his personal relationships. So yeah, hundreds of hours.
That's amazing. And I want to thank you for that. And I should let our listeners know that we're doing this episode a little bit different. Just with we continue to be in a COVID situation here in Canada and our province, and so I continued to explore remote recording. And the last times you and I have recorded together, we've sat socially distanced but apart. And this time we are going to be doing this. We are doing this over Zoom, and so I just want to give our listeners a bit of a context for that because obviously there are some nuances that happen with Zoom. Every once in a while, you have a little glitch here or there because we're talking about the internet. But I just want people to understand that we're doing this a little bit different. So it's a different for me. So today you're a TV star to me, which is awesome. And that's what I love, man. You're an instant TV star. So hey, listen, let's get cracking. Alexander the Great. Fill me in a little bit, Craig. Give me a bit of an overview, a historical overview of his life. Help me understand, help us understand. Where did he come from? Who is he? The man, the myth, the legend. I'm sure that there's a lot of myth out there, as there is with a lot of historical people. There's the legend, and then there's the truth somehow wrapped inside of that, like a little bit of, like a hot dog or something. Right in the middle of there is the truth. And there's sometimes not a lot of meat on there, sometimes not a lot of stuff on the outside, but help us understand, who is this man and why should we be interested in his life?
Okay. Well, he's he was actually he's often associated with the spread of Hellenism, which is really a fancy word for Greek culture, all throughout the Middle and Near and Far East to some extent. But he was actually Macedonian. So he's from north of Macedonia. Basically, Macedonia would be northern part of Greece. And born in 256 BC, which is why you've never met the man. No one has.
I'm old, but I'm not that old.
So he was born a long, long time ago. Like you said, a lot of myth, a lot of legend, and some truth around it. He was actually called the Great by the Romans centuries later. So the Greeks actually didn't refer to him as the Great. The Macedonians, the people he represented, didn't refer to him as the Great. In fact, the Greeks and Macedonians, his own people, probably would have had very mixed feelings about him because, as you alluded to, like a lot of these leaders, he was a bit of a tyrant. Why we talk about him is because by the age of 29, he had conquered everywhere from Greece all the way to what we now know as Pakistan, with an army of no larger than 50,000 soldiers.
Wow.
So
and when did he start? What age did he start at? 29. So by 29, he had conquered all this area with a relatively small army.
Very small.
When did he start those campaigns? Like, how old was he?
So he was about 20. He was the first record we have of him actually taking up arms was when he was in his father's army at age 16. Now, I would say you and I are talking about Alexander the Great today. I actually have a bit of a fascination with his father. If we talk about Alexander for an hour, his father is worth at least 5 hours of conversation. So Alexander inherited his father's intellect, his army, his strategy, his tactics, absolutely everything. So it's almost like he took his father's business.
I was going to say, it's like the family business, but sort of like
really is.
Sort of like the mafia family business.
It kind of is, yeah. He took all these incredible innovations that his father had created and implemented, in particular when it came to political and military reforms, massive military reforms. And he took those and basically put them to work. The reason his father didn't do it is because his father was assassinated. And it's suggested that Alexander had a hand in it. So there's a lot of intrigue around his life.
Interesting. So his younger years, and just as he grows up, and then he finds, I guess, the sense of destiny for him and starts to move into this. Just help us understand a little bit about what does that look like?
Sure. So born in 256, like I said, the birth of these really great people, meaning people who make the history pages, a lot of times their births are, surrounded with a lot of legend and myth. And there was a legend that the night he was born, lightning struck a temple of Artemis. Now, Artemis is one of the Greek gods, goddess of the hunt, but she was also the goddess associated with midwives. And so the legend was the temple burnt down because she was busy helping deliver Alexander the Great himself. I would put that in the legend category.
What you mean that didn't happen? Like the god of midwives did not birth Alexander there's myths surrounding my birth too, but it's not quite the same.
It doesn't have the same panache, right?
No, not quite the same. No.
But he grew up as the son of Philip and his wife Olympia. Both of them were incredibly impressive figures. He grew up in, I guess, a royal court, and you wouldn't see it as a royal court the way you think of, say, an English royal court, but it meant he was literate. So he was educated. He was actually educated by Aristotle, the great philosopher and considered the father of scientific method. He was trained in warfare. So Macedonians were a martial society. Okay, they were kept happy by going to war. They loved going to war. His father always said loved three things in life: wine, women, and war, and not necessarily in that order. And so Alexander grew up in this tough, rugged society, educated, very much privileged, but also very much looking over his shoulder. So Philip had 7 wives, um, and they had children. And so it was a bit of a cutthroat game. When Alexander did finally take power after his father died by assassination, one of the first things he did was he eliminated all his rivals. So that's the
Oh,
dark side of leadership right there.
interesting. He took them all out. So I'm gonna ask you. Obviously, you're speculating, but just what's your gut say? Do you think Alexander, based on your reading and based on your understanding of him as a person, do you think he was involved somehow in the early exit of his father?
Yeah. So, you know what? The great thing about history, when you're talking about someone so old, eventually you just have to come up with an opinion because
Right.
we don't have the eyewitnesses necessarily. I would say, yeah, I'd say it was pretty well the work of him and his mother. His mother was terrifying. We don't know as much about her as we do her husband, which is consistent with, unfortunately, a lot of women in history. Um, but she was terrifying, and I would say probably the two of them were involved with the execution, the assassination of his father. It has almost like a JFK assassination feel to it because the assassin stabbed Philip, killed him, ran off, and then was killed himself in the process by bodyguards. So it has kind of like a Jack Ruby kind of shooting Lee Harvey Oswald, because you know too much. We're afraid you're going to talk. So my gut feeling is, yeah, I'd say Alexander and his mom were behind it.
Interesting. And so as he starts this journey, at what age did he die?
He would have been 30.
Okay, so he starts his campaigns when he's around 20.
Yeah.
He ends his conquest at 29, and how did he die?
Well, like many great leaders, there's a lot of mystery around how he died, and I do tend to go to the more salacious. Um, so yeah, he died of some kind of infection. The debate is whether it was an infection caused by all the wounds that he had received in battle, because he had a lot of wounds, or whether he was actually poisoned. I'm going to go with the poisoning because he had done a because it's just so much more interesting because he had done a lot of things to really get under the skin of his army. And but it could be anything like alcohol consumption, like he was a
Wow.
known alcoholic. It could have been anything, but it happened quite suddenly.
Interesting.
And yeah.
Great. So in 9 years, he goes from beginning these conquests to he's in some ways, would you consider it historically, has he conquered by then, sort of the known world to him, or like where's he reaching out to? Like,
Yeah. So Herodotus, who is called the father of history, he wrote something just called the Histories about 300 years before, about 200 years before Alexander was born. And he's probably the most ancient example of someone who's cataloged the known world. And so he painted a picture of, the world ends, it starts here, in the Mediterranean, and then ends just past what they called India. Of course, we know there's a lot more past India as far as if you're going east. But yeah, I would say he conquered the known world. They knew there was more lands, but he conquered really the superpower of the day.
wow. So did he as he this is happening and just as he's beginning these campaigns and figuring this out, what what was his goal always to do that, or did he have a goal that he focused on and then he found others, or was this ultimately his plan from the very beginning?
So Macedonians and Greeks had a long one. They didn't like each other very much, although they had a lot of similarities. But there's also a long tradition of going to war against the regional superpower, who was Persia, the Great Persian Empire. If you look at the Middle East and the near Middle and Far East as a solar system, Persia would be the sun, and all these other states would be revolving around it. So Greece, Macedonia, Thrace, Scythia, Egypt, all these nations will be kind of revolving around it. But there was there is always a back and forth of Persians defeating Greeks and Macedonians and vice versa, and skirmishes here and there. So there was a long history and a strong desire within Macedonian and Greek society to one day we're going to get you Persians. One day we're going to conquer you. And Philip, his father, was the one who was actually preparing to go to war against Persia, which is why it's also suspected that the Persians had a hand in his assassination. But initially, I would say his first motivation was revenge, because that's what we do. You beat us, we're going to come and get you one of these days. It's almost like you and I used to watch a lot of UFC together.
Yeah.
And promoters would put on these great matches where you'd have, usually, a young up and coming superstar against an old, wildly veteran. And, sure enough, the first couple fights, the veteran would come out on top because he had just enough street smarts to beat the young punk and overcome his physicality. But eventually they just kept promoting these fights because you knew eventually the young up and comer would win the day. And that's, I think, what was going on between Greece and Persia. The Greeks were preparing, like, one day we're going to get you. And Persians knew it. And that's why there was this back and forth. Greek states had resisted Persian rule, consistently. So it started off as revenge, I'd say.
Yeah. So when you look at all of these conquests and different things that you've read about and that, so would you say that there is there one that sticks out in your mind that was the most interesting or the most strategic conquests along the way, as you look at all these different things that he did?
Yeah. Because we know so much about him, it's hard to pick one, but I'm going to pick one anyway.
Okay.
It's the siege of Tyre. And Tyre is a coastal city in modern day Lebanon. It was part of the Phoenician Empire, and I'm a big Phoenician fan. So Phoenicians, for those who like classical history, Phoenicians were the seafarers, the traders. They owned the Mediterranean waters. If you wanted to do business, you did business with Phoenicians. And Tyre, the city, was broken into two parts. This was early in Alexander's campaign. So he'd already conquered a few lands in Asia Minor, or what we now know as Turkey. So he conquered a few. He had his first big battle against the Persians. But then he keeps making his way down the coastline of the Eastern Mediterranean and comes to Tyre. And by then his reputation is in place. And the Tyrians kind of played a bit of a game with him. The Phoenicians played a bit of a game with him. So he had two parts of Tyre, one on land and then one on an island about a mile offshore. So old Tyre was on land, new Tyre was on the water. And the Tyrians, the Phoenicians, they resisted his rule. He basically submit or else. They didn't want to submit, and so he went to war with them. And unfortunately, his army was not a seafaring army, and so he had to find a way to conquer the island. And it took him about 14 months. And he basically built a land bridge a mile into the Mediterranean just to get to that island.
Wow.
Yeah, and to this day, like, he changed the geography. To this day, that exists. That land bridge still exists, connecting that little island to the land, and that was because of Alexander the Great's determination to get there.
Wow. So he built. Okay. So let me just get my head around this. So he for 14 months there's this great process of building this land bridge, and it's coming closer and closer and closer to this island, effectively. And that's the way that he says, I'm coming to get you. So for 14 months, they see him inching closer towards him.
Yeah. And they were very confident because other people had tried to conquer them in the past and failed. It's hard to siege an island. And they put up some incredible resistance. I mean, the story of their resistance and the ingenuity that they implemented just to harass him, from creating like ships that were designed just to burn. They just, sailed ships into the land bridge. And then at the last minute, kind of like Dukes of Hazzard, lit them on fire, jumped off and let it kind of crash and destroy all the siege works and cause panic and terror. It's a really great story. He did finally get there, unfortunately for the Phoenicians.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So obviously the other leaders that we've talked about, they, at least in my mind, they had, they obviously had some ugly parts of their personality and their life. I mean, because they're human. We continually talk about that dichotomy when we talk together. When I thought of talking about Alexander the Great, again, I see him just in my little puny mind, because I haven't studied him. I see him as a guy who, his claim to fame is he was really good at killing people, taking lands.
Yeah.
And again, if I'm on his side, I think he's a hero, and if I'm not, I think he's a villain. Um, but so we look at that, and we want to find some things within his life
Mhm.
that we can be inspired or encouraged by somehow.
Yeah.
The thought I had as we came to this conversation, I was thinking about it. I was thinking a little bit about something my grandfather said to me years ago, and he said it specifically about criticism to me. But I want to apply it to this, and that was when I was younger, I had real difficulty receiving criticism. I would reject it. I'd push it all away. And my grandfather he wasn't an educated man, but he was a wise man. And I remember him once saying to me, Tim, the problem is that you cannot learn anything if you reject all criticism. He said, criticism's like food. You should eat it. And he was an old German, so he was a little crass at times. So I'll just tell you and people exactly what he said. He said, Tim, criticism's like food. Eat it, get the nutrients you need from it, and shit out what you don't need. But if you don't eat it, you can't learn from it. And this may be a terrible analogy, but I almost feel like this a little bit with this conversation today. It's like there's a lot of really bad things in that we could associate with Alexander. Particularly, again, it's easy to wash history because we didn't experience his tyranny of his reign or his aggression. But I almost feel like that. It's like we should chew on his whole life, and then maybe there's some stuff that we can just sort of we can discard, and then there's some stuff we even in the midst of all that we can learn some stuff from him. And so that with that context, you and I have chatted a little bit of a couple things. I want you to share about two or three things that you have found just inspiring or interesting as you've looked at him, that you can say, I can take this and I can be inspired or encouraged by it somehow.
Yeah. So he's well known for one positive quality. There's several, but there's one really positive quality that sticks out. It's his personal courage, and we talk a lot about leading from the front. Leaders need to be there at the forefront of initiatives, but leading from the front for Alexander was quite sacred, and leading from the front for him meant putting himself in harm's way, quite literally. Like he was literally the tip of the spear in almost every conflict.
Huh.
And that's why I always said there's a good chance he died from infections caused by, because he had so many wounds. And we don't live in an era now where military leaders lead from the front.
Right.
They lead from command centers miles and miles and miles away, operating laser guided missiles. And I think to believe in what you're doing so much, to put yourself in harm's way, I take that as there's a real takeaway for me there. And there's no doubt his followers, his soldiers were definitely inspired by that. He got a lot of mileage out of that. Part of it was expected, part of the culture. It was expected that, yes, your commander will be up at the front, taking arrows and blocking blows. He died almost. He almost had 9 lives, to be honest with you, where he was this close to death that we know. And I think, being willing to put yourself in harm's way because you believe in something so much is pretty outstanding. I'd say that's a very commendable quality that he had.
Yeah, so that's one thing that you can be inspired by about what does it mean to believe so much in your cause that you're willing to lead from the front,
Yeah.
even if there's a possibility of your own harm. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously in business today and in life today, we don't live with the same sense of harm as leaders, but it is a really important idea in relationship to what true leadership believes. At the end of the day, it's hard to argue with a guy and their belief if they're leading the charge and they're out in front, as
Yeah.
opposed to sitting back behind the line and encourage you to go first.
Yeah.
And that's a leadership principle that I've always espoused to. In fact, I've been doing some training recently with one of my clients, and we've been talking about leadership values. And a number of years ago, I wrote a leadership value statement, a leadership philosophy statement for myself, and it starts with actually leaders go first. That's the first line in my personal leadership philosophy: leaders go first.
Mm.
So he was a leader that went first. And as much as we can argue with what he was doing or how he accomplished it, the reality is he went first, and he catalyzed belief and faith in others, I'm assuming, through that
Yeah.
process. And that is truly great leaders. Now, the reality is you could be leading towards good or ill,
Mm.
but that behavior is laudable and commendable on many levels. Now, he was clearly, I mean, as you talk about it, he clearly he was a visionary. I mean, he had a sense of vision as well. What does being a visionary look like for him, and how did it maybe change or evolve over the time?
Right. So I talked a little bit about the history between the Greeks and the Persians and that tug of war, that back and forth. I'm going to get you one day. Initially, I think his vision started off as revenge. It's our turn to land a couple punches on you now. But then once he had his revenge by conquering a couple key places, then it moved from revenge to conquest. Not only do I want to get revenge just for the sake of it, and that was part of the cruelty of him as well. And it was a dog eat dog world at the time. But then it moved to conquest. Not only do I want to get revenge and get a little bit of a foothold here, actually, I want to conquer the known world. And he did it. He did outside the military's accomplishments that we talk a lot about. He's actually one of the first, or at least the first that I've read about, who, when he went on campaign, he brought other disciples of Aristotle with him. He brought philosophers with him. He brought Callisthenes, who was his official biographer, with him / propaganda minister. He regularly sent back, samples, like plant samples, back to Aristotle, because he was exploring the lands that they weren't familiar with. He regularly sent back rare animals back to Greece. He regularly sent things back. So, it went from revenge to conquest to exploration. I think he wanted to answer the great question: where does the world end? What is in this world? And I think the vision is there. Like, he had it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not convinced his soldiers had that last part of the vision, the
Sure.
exploration part.
That's interesting, because I think that's probably true of a lot of leaders. What the impetus that you start out with changes over time. And there's an evolution in all of us. I mean, we're all evolving. We're changing. We're not stagnant. We're growing. We're changing. And sometimes we begin our careers, whether it's as a leader or not, we do certain things for certain reasons. And as we mature and as things change, the behavior looks the same, but the reason for it changes, which is the way I hear what you're saying, which is fascinating, because I'm sort of discovering this conversation as we go as well. And so as you talk, I'm recognizing maybe my own maturation as a leader too. There are times maybe in my career or as leaders that I've worked with, where sometimes you do certain things for certain reasons, which are not always the best reasons in the beginning. And then you begin to clarify, or your compass begins to change and you point in a different direction. So that's a fascinating journey, sort of revenge to conquest to exploration. Like, when we think of explorers, we laud them. We think of the great things. We don't see them as military people. We see them as people who are advancing culture and advancing society and helping us understand ourselves and the human story and all biology and all of these things. And yet we don't see Alexander the Great as an explorer. I don't when I think of him. I think of him as in that revenge and conquest thing. So that's an interesting insight into him, and it inspires me as well, that I need to keep growing and challenging myself as I move out. And so I think sometimes leaders particularly younger leaders in their early career, again, they can be doing certain things because they want to prove themselves. That's sort of that conquest thing. And then over time, you begin to realize it's not about proving yourself. It is about exploring things for you and your team, for the benefit of your customers or for your team, in a different way. So that's an interesting journey, and I would encourage my listeners even to think about that. What does your journey look like over the time of your life as you've gone? What is the purpose for which you do things? Has it changed? Has it evolved? Has it progressed? Because it sounds like that's a little bit what we're talking about, which is really interesting. So I'm assuming then, when you talk about that, Craig, that his exploration must have been driven by something. I mean, if it wasn't just conquest anymore, eventually it was that explorer nature. What do you think was happening for him? Was it, was he adventurous? Was he, did he wonder about things? I mean, do we have anything in writings that help us understand that side of his personality?
I studied, I think Arian is the way you pronounce his name, one of the earlier biographers of Alexander the Great. And he uses the Greek word pathos.
Hmm.
And pathos is desire, but it doesn't translate really well into English. It's almost like compulsion, So Arian says Alexander developed a pathos to go invade Persia. He had a pathos to explore the world. He had just this curiosity about what was out there. Now, one thing I didn't touch on about when he was young, on his mother's side, part of their lineage was they believed they were related to the great Greek hero Achilles, a demigod, one of the great heroes of antiquity, showed it up in Homer's Odyssey, Iliad, which, by the way, Alexander the Great took as literal. He didn't take that as myth or fiction. He thought that was really the way the world works. So on his mother's side, he believed he was a son of Achilles, so to speak. On his father's side, his father traces lineage back to the great Greek hero Hercules. So I think within him there was a desire, a pathos, to be as great as his ancestors were. I think you could say that's maybe part of the reason why he could have murdered his father, because his father was on the verge of becoming as great as his ancestors were, and he wanted that for himself. So he wanted, I would say he wanted legacy. He was really interested in building a legacy for himself and discovering the world of Herodotus. You got to remember, Herodotus was a great historian. These historians were fantastic, but they also talked about, mysterious creatures in India, cyclops that lived above the Black Sea. What little boy doesn't want to go explore a world where there's monsters and dragons? And at times when I'm looking at his adventures, because I now describe them as adventures, he almost reminds me of a little boy going on an adventure with a very deadly force, mind you, but someone who's going to go where no one has gone before and have that reputation.
Interesting. As you talk about that, Craig, I think about, you and I and our wives took an adventure a year ago prior to COVID, and we went to the east coast of Canada. And we went to Oak Island together, and again, it's it's the same spirit. It's the spirit of adventure and
Yeah.
children and exploration and treasure hunting and all this stuff, which oftentimes maybe leads us to bad behavior, but it's a powerful part of what drives humans to do extraordinary things is the sense of adventure, which I happen to believe that so many of us in North America, because of the way our lives work and just the way it works, we've lost really a sense of adventure about the world. The world we know it. We know everything. We feel like we know everything. I'm not a scientist. I'm not exploring new ideas that never have been thought of before. And so, do I really live with a sense of adventure? That's a great term. And as you talk, I'm actually reminded, and this, my listeners may not believe this, but this is just happenstance. I'm thinking right now about what I read off the back of the Natterjack jacket of this whiskey, because here's how I read this. And again, it's so applicable to what we're talking about. Reckless, maybe. Adventurous, absolutely.
Yeah,
And
that's funny.
I wasn't planned, but I'm just thinking about it. Reckless, maybe. Was he reckless? Yeah. Am I reckless at time? Yeah. But adventurous, absolutely. And I wish I could say to myself, am I adventurous? Absolutely. I don't think that's true. Am
Hmm.
I adventurous as I need to be as a person and a leader? No. And again, maybe that's a thought that people can explore a little bit. Are you adventurous as much as you need to be in your life for the sake of yourself and others? It's a great, it's a great question to consider. So, Craig, I've got, I did a bit of research because I want to pretend that I'm smart. I'm not that smart. I've got this faithful friend called the internet, and the internet isn't always a faithful friend. But as I prepared for this conversation, I just began to explore Alexander a little bit because again, I didn't really know a lot about him, but appreciate the insights you've shared. And we could spend hours and hours talking about this one person, and obviously today we won't do that. But there were four particular quotes that I read about Alexander. Now, some may be myth and some may not even be his, and you could correct me because they may not be. But there's four particular quotes I came across which I found interesting. And again, I haven't shared these with you in advance, so I'm going to put you on the spot. But I want to read them to you one by one, and I'd like you to comment on them, on the quote and maybe what it is that how you see it connected to his life. One of the quotes I came across said this: "How should a man be capable of grooming his own horse or of furbishing his own spear and helmet if he allows himself to become unaccustomed to tending even his own person? Which is his most treasured belonging?" Interesting quote.
Yeah, and I know that quote, and it's allegedly said by him, and it was in reference to one of his leading generals, who he felt had gotten a little, I guess, soft. So who was known for being very, I guess, flamboyant. How about this? He liked his creature comforts and liked to display them. And Alexander liked his creature comforts too, but Macedonian culture he was a general of generals. Like, he didn't like to flaunt his wealth around as far as by wearing lavish clothes. He believed in kind of having a little bit of self-restraint when it came to that. And that was just a rebuke that he had given that general at one point in time. Like, how can you lead when you value all these other things and you don't know how to do the very basics of being a Macedonian infantryman? You're too removed. You are too removed from what's really, really important as a leader, which is be close to your soldiers. And that goes back to Alexander. He led from the front. He intermingled with his soldiers. He was a master, I think, of human psychology. He was trained in medicine himself. As a leader, was trained in medicine. So it was not uncommon to see him personally bandaging his soldiers' wounds. I think that's kind of an interesting anecdote there as well.
That is, and again, a great leadership principle. You got to take care of your people. They're fighting a battle for you at some level. Maybe not a historic military battle, but they're fighting for you. Whether if you're a leader of a community organization and you got people in your organization, they're fighting for you. They're contending for your cause. If you're part of a religious group, you got people who are contending for that idea. If you're part of a business, you've got people who are contending on the front lines, and there is wounding that happens as we go to war, as it's so to say, in the areas we work. So that's also an interesting principle. I've often told leaders, one of the responsibilities of leaders is again, it's the care, emotional, physical care of your team.
Right.
Because if they're not cared for well, they can't perform well. So that's interesting. Great. Thanks for bringing that context. And again, I want to be really clear. Our listeners right now may think that this was pre-planned, but it wasn't. I have four quotes that you don't even know about.
No,
and I'm going to give them to you, and we're going to see where we go. The second one is this, and I found this one really fascinating. "I am not afraid of any army of lions led by a sheep. I'm afraid of an army of sheep led by a lion."
Yeah. And that just tells, and I've heard this quote as well. And so this just tells you the power of a strong leader, focused leader. And the whole thing is that, strong leader up at the front, the sheep will follow. The sheep will follow, and they'll almost become lions themselves. And I think that's what he's referencing. Like, he brought out something. Again, it was a martial. Macedonians, they were fighters. he brought out something, a ferocity from them by proxy, I guess is the best way of putting it. And so I think that's what that quote is referencing to. Like, hey, I'm actually more afraid of the person up at the top and the influence and the ability they have to motivate, empower, equip their own people beneath them.
Again, so a great challenge to us as leaders. Are you sheepish or are you lionish? Do you have that? Again, we can talk about the bravery of lions. We can talk about lots of different things, but it's an interesting thing to think about. The next quote that I want to give you is this: when we give someone our time, we are actually giving a portion of our life that we can never take back.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. So I think as far as Alexander goes, it's the sacred nature, of relationships, and understanding how to manage those relationships and the time that you put into those relationships. And I feel like I'm kind of keep repeating the same thing, because his admirable quality was the time that he gave to his generals, by the way, who were all his childhood friends. So that's one thing we didn't talk about. These were all his childhood friends. So that's why I said he almost has a boyish sense of adventure. I'm going to take my merry band and go romping around the world with Daddy's army, But he understood that the greatest resource he had was the time and the moments that he spent in front of his soldiers, with his generals, listening to them, and understanding that time was finite. And I think that's also why he knew it was like a bit of a race against the clock for him. I think he kind of knew, like, I'm going to die one of these days, and I got to conquer as much as I can. I got to make as much of a name for myself in the short time I have here, because I don't have a lot of time. It is finite. And so there's a couple things there.
Yeah, and when you say that, when I thought of this quote, I thought is I think one of the challenge for us in 2021 as developed people, most of the clocks we look at now, I look at, are digital. Years ago they were analog, but they all fail in helping us understand, because they're not an hourglass.
Right.
An hourglass. When I think of that, it's that sand ever slipping through the small, portal of our now moment, and then it funnels into this cavity of what's already done. And there's a finite amount of sand in there, and it ticks away. And that's the truth of our lives, whether we really understand it or not. And so when I read that quote, the thing that inspires me to understand is time is a precious, ever diminishing resource. And what I do with it matters. The people I give my time to, what I give my time to matters, because you can never take it back again. You can't get it back again. And so again, my challenge to you that are listening is, be careful you don't just look at the digital clock of your lives. That doesn't seem to ever end. The reality is that we live in an hourglass. Our lives are within that hourglass. There's a finite amount of sand inside there. And again, depending on your proposition, it's it's happenstance how many grains you get in, or it's destiny, or maybe Hercules himself has determined how much sand is in your hourglass. But what you do with your time matters. And that quote really reminded me of that. And here's the last quote that I just found interesting, that I found. Upon the conduct of each depends the fate of all.
Yeah, well, that's classic team. That is classic understanding that collectively we are dependent upon one another. The formation, just the battle formation, going back to some of the military stuff with Alexander, was the Greek phalanx. And the Greek phalanx, it's designed where basically you're packed in really, really tight together with your spears. Sarissas was the weapon that they use, and it's a special spear. But you have a shield, and that shield is so broad, it covers part of the body of the man next to you, and then next to him, and then next, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. The Greek phalanx worked because they drilled it into everyone. This is how it works. And it only works when you move in unison with one another. And there was a really dramatic story where he took that to great effect. He didn't actually have to lift a finger. He just demonstrated how the Greek phalanx could work and put on like a military parade. And the attackers were so awestruck by the unity of the movement that they didn't even fight. They just ran away.
Wow, that's fascinating. And when I read that comment, I just thought of the challenge for us so often. Again, we get lost in the army or we get lost in the team, but it's the conduct of each. Upon the conduct of each depends the fate of all. So it is individual conduct, it is individual behavior that ultimately determines the fate of the team. It's not the behavior of the team or the all that determines the individual. It is the conduct of each. And I also found it fascinating, the word conduct. Again, not the thinking, not the ideas, not the belief, the conduct. It comes down to action and conduct. And again, it's just a real reminder to me that whether it's in society or whether it's in a business or whether it's in a church community or faith community or whether it's in a social community, our individual conduct matters. We can't have a society, we can't have a business that somehow equals greater than our own conduct as we add it up across the line of soldiers in our business. If my conduct lacks integrity and so does everyone across the line, then we as a group lack integrity. If my conduct doesn't have compassion in it, then we can't be compassionate as a group. It's a great reminder to me that what I do matters. How I think matters. How I behave matters. And so often I believe in culture, particularly as societies grow and get bigger and we become the smaller piece of this larger thing, we get disconnected, I think, from that idea. Now, obviously, if you're 50,000 people or a couple thousand soldiers on a line, you're very connected to the fact that your behavior matters for your own survival and for the survival of others. As we get into these larger pools of culture and society and business, as business grows and grows and grows, when Amazon starts out and it's 10 guys in a garage, your behavior matters, but when it's thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of employees across the globe, you start to think, it doesn't really matter what I do anymore, but it matters. And that quote reminds me of that for sure. So listen, Craig, I want to thank you so much. I got a question for you. Seriously, when are you going to start your own podcast? Dude, come on. Because I give you this little bit of time. You spend hundreds of hours researching Alexander, and you get half the conversation with me over like 45 minutes. Dude, when are you going to start your own podcast? Come on, get your game on, brother.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. This is a good time. Obviously, I enjoy this tremendously. You and I've talked about this quite extensively for the last year. And, the goal is this year to do it. I don't know at what point in time, but I've got lots of interesting stories and characters. I love sharing them with you right now.
Yeah, and I'm being serious. You got to do that because there's so much more that you could share about Alexander that we're not going to braille into today at all. But you've got to do it because I'll be a listener. And I know there's a lot of people that I know. I've got some friends that are real historians. I think of one guy I work with at a company, and he loves history, and he always comments on the podcast that you and I do about history because he's a historian. He loves history. He's fascinated by it. And again, it's the story of the human, and that is just powerful to us. Yeah. So you got to do it, please. You got to do it. And if you don't, I'm going to come over. I'm going to disconnect Zoom. I'm going to come over and I kick your ass. Because you got to do it because there's so much more we could talk about. We obviously don't have time for all that. But listen, as we finish up, is there one story or one challenge that you would want to leave the listeners today about Alexander? Is there, just as we finish, I'll give that to you and then I'll wrap up after.
I would say it's a big, wonderful world out there, and I think there's still adventures to be had. And my takeaway as I've got into him wasn't I want to conquer everything. It was I want to maintain a curiosity about the world, and maybe I've let my life become a little too stagnant and predictable and safe, and maybe lacking in a little bit of the adventure. So I would say, be curious about the world, there's a lot of ventures out there, and there's a lot of lands I think still to explore, either literally or metaphorically.
Awesome. And thanks, Craig. And I just want to add to that. So be curious, explore, but don't kill anybody along the way. Okay.
Please don't.
Just a caveat. All right. Don't kill kindness. Don't kill your neighbor.
That's right.
Kill the revengeful heart in you.
Hmm.
Kill the desire just to conquer things for conquering's sake. That's what I
Hmm.
would say.
Yeah.
Explore. That's a great encouragement. And so, as always, Craig, an inspiring and insightful conversation, and just really appreciate your discipline of study and research and understanding. And so I just want to say, as we wrap up, as you think about this conversation today, just reflect a little bit about some of the things we talked about, Alexander, the side trails that we talked about. Be curious; it's a great opportunity. And as you do, as you begin to explore that, please let Craig and I know how you're drinking this in, like we did. We drank in a whiskey today, and then and that was a distilled spirit, and it comes through age, and there's a wisdom thing that happens. That's why I like drinking whiskey with Craig, because it reminds me of the history of these drinks. But as you explore these ideas, do us a favor. Reach out to me at tim@theuncommodified.com, or find me on social media, and let Craig and I know what you're doing with these ideas. How are you challenging yourself with this conversation? Because if it's just a conversation, it becomes like dead words on pages of a history book. But we have the ability to keep this stuff alive, so it isn't just history or the past, but we can make it part of our present and part of our future, but only as we activate some of the thinking or ideas that we've heard today. And so as you do, let us know what you're doing. Thank you so much for listening. Have an excellent day, and cheers to you again, my friend.
Cheers, Tim.
And now my new podcasting handle is Natterjack. I love it. Have an excellent day, everybody. Thanks, Craig.